The wind came down from the mountain that night the way it always did in late winter, sharp enough to find every gap in the wood and every crack in the stone. Marcus had learned to sleep through it. He had learned to sleep through most things since the fever took his mother and father, since the snow took his younger brother 2 winters after that. The cabin was quiet now in a way it had never been quiet when he was a boy, and quiet was something a man could get used to if he had no other choice. He woke because something was breathing against his chest. Not the wind, not the old dog he no longer owned. Something small, warm, and alive, tucked into the curve of his arm like it had always belonged there. Marcus lay still in the dark, heart suddenly loud in his ears, and listened to that steady little breath rise and fall against him. He did not move for a long moment. 3 nights now. 3 nights he had woken to find something curled against him under the same wool blanket his grandfather had once carried across 2 mountain ranges. And 3 nights he had told himself it was a dream, or a barn cat that had found a gap in the door, or his own tired mind playing tricks after too many years alone. It was not a barn cat. He reached down slowly, careful not to startle whatever it was, and his fingers found scales instead of fur. Small, warm, faintly ridged scales no bigger than his palm, rising and falling with each breath. He froze. Somewhere in the dark, 2 eyes opened and caught what little moonlight came through the shutters, and they were not the eyes of anything that belonged in these mountains. They were narrow, gold, and entirely unafraid of him. Marcus had grown up on stories about dragons the way every child in the valley had. Tales meant to frighten young ones into staying close to the fire, or old hunters boast about creatures no living man had actually seen. He had never once believed he would wake up with one breathing against his ribs. It did not try to run. That was the strangest part. It simply looked at him, blinked once, slow and trusting, and pressed itself a little closer into the warmth of his side, as if his blanket were the safest place in the entire world. He should have thrown it out into the cold. Any sensible man would have. A creature like this meant trouble, meant questions in the village, meant things he did not have room for in a life he had built carefully around having nothing left to lose. He told himself all of this in the dark, and still, he did not move. Instead, he watched it sleep. Its scales were a deep, dusty green, the color of pine needles in shadow, and along its back ran a faint line of ridges that caught the moonlight like tiny blades. It was thinner than it should have been. He could count the shape of its small ribs beneath the scales, could see the way its sides moved a little too fast, a little too shallow, the breathing of something that had gone hungry more nights than not. Something in his chest ached in a way he had not let it ache in a long time. By the time the gray light of morning crept through the shutters, the creature was gone. Marcus sat up fast, half convinced now that he really had dreamed the whole thing, until he saw the blanket beside him, still warm in the shape of something curled small and round. He threw off the covers and crossed the cold floor to the door, and that was when he saw them. Tracks small, clawed, unmistakable, pressed into the thin crust of snow that had fallen overnight. They led away from his door in a line, down past the woodpile, past the fence he had never finished mending, and toward the dark tree line at the edge of his land. He stood there in the doorway a long moment, the cold biting at his bare feet, staring at those tracks and at the space where they simply stopped being visible under the trees. No door had been left open. No window had been broken. He lived alone at the very edge of the village, half a mile from the nearest neighbor, in a cabin with walls his own hands had built tight against the wind. There was no way anything should have gotten in. And yet, 3 nights running, something had. Marcus pulled his coat from the hook by the door, laced his boots with hands that were not quite steady, and stepped out into the snow, following the only trail that might finally give him an answer. The tracks were easy enough to follow at first, small and evenly spaced, cutting a clean line through the snow toward the tree line. Marcus kept his rifle slung over one shoulder out of habit more than fear. Whatever had been sleeping against his chest for 3 nights had not felt like a threat. It had felt like something that needed help. The trees swallowed the morning light fast, and the air grew colder under their shadow, the kind of cold that settled into stone and stayed there. He followed the tracks another quarter-mile, past the frozen creek bed, up a narrow game trail he had not walked since he was a boy hunting rabbits with his brother. The tracks grew harder to see the deeper he went, brushed over in places by wind, but he had spent enough years reading trails in this forest to know where they were leading, toward the old rock face, toward the caves. He heard the sound before he saw anything. A thin, high chittering, almost like birdsong, except birds did not sound frightened the way this did. Marcus rounded a fallen pine and stopped cold. The den was little more than a shallow hollow beneath an overhanging ledge, half collapsed on one side, where stone had come down at some point, crushing what might have once been a wider opening, and huddled together in the middle of it, pressed into a shivering pile for warmth, were 4 more of them, not 1 dragon, 5. He stood frozen at the tree line, watching as they untangled themselves at the sound of his boots crunching snow, small heads lifting, wary and hungry all at once. One was a deep, dusty green, the one he now recognized from his own blanket, and it was already pushing forward past its siblings, unafraid, chirping at him like it was scolding him for taking so long. The others hung back. A smaller one, a soft blue-gray, nearly the color of the morning sky, pressed itself behind its siblings and would not meet his eyes at all. Beside it, a reddish-orange one kept losing its balance on the uneven stone, stumbling sideways with every attempt to get closer, only to right itself and try again with the same stubborn determination. A 4th, darker and broader than the rest, was already sniffing hopefully at the pouch on Marcus's belt where he kept dried meat for long hunts. And the last, smallest of them all, simply sat and watched it with wide, unblinking eyes, too weak or too cautious to move at all. Marcus crouched slowly at the edge of the den, close enough now to see the truth of it. They were starving. Their scales, which should have held a healthy shine even at this young age, looked dull and thin, stretched over ribs that showed too clearly. There was no adult dragon anywhere in sight, no nest of warmth beyond what they made huddled together, no sign that anyone had been feeding them in some time. He unhooked the pouch from his belt without thinking twice and set the strips of dried meat down on a flat stone. The dark one lunged first, snatching a piece and retreating to a safe distance to eat. The clumsy orange one followed a heartbeat later, tumbling over its own feet in its hurry. One by one, hunger won out over caution, until even the smallest, the one that had not moved at all, crept forward and took its share. Marcus watched them eat and felt something shift his chest that he did not have a name for yet. It was the green one, still, that came to him last, walking straight past the food to press itself against his knee instead, exactly the way it had pressed against his ribs 3 nights running, as if he mattered more than the meal. He was still crouched there, one hand resting carefully on its narrow back, when he noticed the marks on the far wall of the den, long gouges for claws wide, raked deep into the stone, high enough that whatever made them stood taller than any bear in these mountains. Below the marks, the rock was scorched black, the kind of burn that came from fire, not from any hunter's torch. Something had happened here, something violent, and recent enough that the black char had not yet been softened by weather. Marcus looked from the scorched marks to the 5 small, trusting faces gathered around him, and understood, with a cold certainty settling low in his stomach, that whatever had once protected these creatures was no longer here to do it. He gathered them into his coat, one by one, the way he might have once gathered fallen lambs during a bad storm, and started back down the trail toward home, unaware that high above him, from a ridge lost in morning mist, something far larger than any of the creatures in his arms was watching every step he took. Marcus carried all 5 of them home wrapped in the folds of his coat, and by the time he reached his cabin door, his arms ached in a way that had nothing to do with weight. He built up the fire higher than he had in years, laid an old blanket down close to the hearth, and watched 5 small shapes arrange themselves into a pile of warmth, already fast asleep before he had finished latching the door. He told himself it would only be for a few days, long enough to get some strength back into them, long enough to think of somewhere better suited for wild creatures than a blacksmith's cabin. He was still telling himself that a week later, when the pile by the fire had grown used to shifting over to make room for his boots each morning, and the green one had taken to following him from room to room like a shadow that chirped. He noticed, too, that each of them had found its own way of being. The dark one ate first and ate fastest, always hovering near whatever meal Marcus was preparing, patient in a particular way of something that never wanted to go hungry again. The orange one had not gotten any less clumsy, tripping over the same uneven floorboard nearly every single day, and yet never seemed discouraged by it. The blue-gray one still kept its distance from everyone but its siblings, watching Marcus from across the room with careful, measuring eyes, warming to him slowly an inch at a time. And the smallest one, the quiet one, had taken to falling asleep pressed against Marcus's boot whenever he sat by the fire, as though simply being near him was enough. It was the green one, though, that never left his side at all, day or night, and Marcus had stopped pretending he minded. He might have kept the whole of its secret a while longer, if not for old Tomas from 2 farms over, who came looking for a mended plow blade, and left considerably faster than he arrived, white-faced and refusing to say why. Word moved through a mountain village the way fire moved through dry grass. By the end of that week, half the valley knew the blacksmith was keeping dragons in his cabin, and the other half refused to believe it until they saw the tracks in his yard for themselves. The council did not summon him so much as simply appear at his door, for the valley's older men standing stiff in the cold, uneasy in the way people are uneasy around something they do not understand. They spoke of danger to the livestock, danger to the children, of stories their grandfathers had told about dragons that grew large enough to swallow a barn hole. Marcus listened without much to say in his own defense, because in truth, he did not entirely disagree with their fear. He simply looked past them, toward 5 small shapes watching nervously from the cabin window, and found he could not make himself feel the same way about it. He was still standing in his doorway, turning over what to tell them, when the shadow crossed the yard. It came without sound at first, a darkness sweeping low and fast over snow, gone before any of them could properly look up to find its source. The 4 councilmen went still. One of the horses tied at Marcus's fence reared hard enough to snap its lead, somewhere above the tree line, higher than any bird had business flying. Something enormous banked once against the gray winter sky and was gone behind the ridge. No one spoke for a long moment. Marcus felt his pulse climbing, not from fear exactly, but from the sudden, absolute certainty that whatever had made those claw marks in the stone, whatever had been missing from that den, had just found where its young ones had gone. The council men left in considerably more of a hurry than they had arrived, promising nothing except that this conversation was far from finished. Marcus barely heard them go. He was still staring up at the ridge, at the empty gray sky where something vast had simply vanished, when he felt small claws climbing up the back of his leg. The blue-gray one, the shy one, had left its siblings for the first time to press itself against him, trembling, that night, long after the fire had burned low and the 5 of them had settled into their usual pile against the side. The mountain made a sound Marcus had never heard in all his years living beneath it, a single, deep roar, low enough to feel in the floorboards, rolling down from somewhere high on a ridge and echoing off every stone face in the valley. Then nothing. Only silence and the sound of his own heartbeat and 5 small bodies pressed just a little closer against him in the dark. The strangers arrived 3 days later, in the gray hour just after dawn, driving a cart loaded with goods no one in the valley had ordered. They called themselves traders, said they had come up from the lowlands looking to buy furs and scrap iron before the deep snows closed the passes for good. There were 3 of them, all men Marcus did not recognize, dressed a little too well for the kind of trading they claimed to be doing. He might not have thought twice about them at all, if not for the way the tallest one's eyes moved past him and settled on the cabin window, where the orange one had chosen exactly the wrong moment to press its clumsy face against the glass. The man's expression did not change. That was what struck Marcus later, turning it over in his mind. A stranger seeing a dragon for the first time should have shown something, fear or wonder or disbelief. This man had simply looked, filed away like a fact worth remembering, and gone back to discussing the price of iron as though nothing at all had happened. Marcus sent them off without selling them anything, telling himself it was only caution. He did not like the careful way the shortest of 3 had studied his fence line, his outbuildings, the distance from his door to the tree line, the way a man studies ground he intends to cross again. He should have trusted that feeling sooner. It was 2 nights later, walking the ridge trail in the dark to check a snare line, he had nearly forgotten in the business of caring for 5 growing dragons, that Marcus saw the firelight where no fire should have been, a hollow half a mile from his own land, tucked out of sight from the village road. He left the trail and moved closer through the trees, slow and silent the way years of hunting had taught him, until he could make out the 3 men from the cart, and a 4th he had not seen before, spreading a length of oiled canvas over something laid out on the frozen ground. He got close enough to see the map. It was a rough thing, drawn in charcoal on stretched hide, showing the valley in crude but accurate lines, the village, the river, the mountain trails. And there, circled twice in dark red ink, sat his own cabin, marked clearly enough that there could be no mistake. Beside the map lay something that turned his stomach cold. Coiled nets waited at the edges, iron hooks, filed sharp, and laid across a folded cloth, a set of blades fitted with strange, dark handles, each one inlaid with small, overlapping plates that caught the firelight with dull, familiar shine. Scales, old dragon scales, worked into the hilts of weapons meant for taking more. He heard enough of their low conversation to understand the shape of it, even without every word. A buyer somewhere south, a warlord who paid in gold for anything with scales still attached, alive or otherwise. Word had reached him, somehow, that the last of an old bloodline had turned up in a mountain village too small and too far from anywhere to properly defend itself. 5 of them, the tall one said, counting on his fingers, worth a small fortune between them, and worth considerably more if the villagers were too frightened of dragons to put up much of a fight protecting them. They meant to come at night, 2 days, maybe 3, while they finished scouting the ground and waited for a moon dark enough to move unseen. Marcus made his way home to the trees with his heart hammering harder than the cold could account for, replaying every detail, the map, the circle house, the sharpened hooks, until each piece settled into a single, unavoidable shape. These men had not stumbled onto the valley by chance. Someone, somewhere, had sent word ahead of exactly what to look for, and exactly where to find it. He reached his cabin as the first gray light was creeping over the ridge, and found all 5 of them waiting at the door the way they always did now, the green one already pressing anxious against his leg before he had even crossed a yard, as though it could sense something had changed. Marcus knelt in the snow and gathered them close, feeling for the first time the full weight of what he had let happen, without ever quite meaning to. He had told himself for 2 weeks that this was temporary, that he was simply keeping 5 hungry creatures alive until something better came along. He understood now, kneeling in the cold with small warm bodies pressed against him from every side, that there would be no place better than this, not for them, and not any more for him either. Whatever was coming down that mountain trail in 2 or 3 nights, he was not going to let it take them without a fight. He spent the whole of the next day preparing for a fight. He was not entirely certain he could win. He checked every blade in his forge, sharpened what needed sharpening, and reinforced the shutters over his windows with iron strips meant for something sturdier than wood. It was not enough. He understood that even as he worked, 4 armed men with dragon-scale weapons and nets built for exactly this purpose were not going to be stopped by a blacksmith and a set of reinforced shutters. He went to the village that evening and told them everything. Not all of them believed him at first, not until old Tomas, still shaken from his one glimpse of the cabin weeks before, spoke up in his defense. It was the councilmen who had come to his door before, the ones who wanted the dragons gone, who surprised him most. Fear, it turned out, could point in more than one direction. When they understood that armed strangers meant to come armed onto their mountain, take what they wanted, and leave nothing but trouble behind, the same men who had distrusted Marcus found themselves standing in his yard by nightfall with axes and old hunting bows, unwilling to let outsiders decide anything for their valley. It still would not be enough. Marcus knew that too. 5 villagers with axes were not going to stand long against trained men with hooks and nets, and a warlord's coin behind them. There was only one thing on the mountain with any real chance of turning the balance, and it had been watching him for weeks without ever once coming close enough to ask. He left before first light the next morning, climbing the ridge trail alone, the same trail the shadow had crossed weeks before. He carried nothing but his grandfather's blanket, folded under one arm, and a certainty he could not fully explain even to himself. The climb took most of the morning. The air grew thinner, the trees sparser, until he came out onto a wide stone shelf near the ridge line, and there, coiled among the rocks like something carved from the mountain itself, waited the guardian. She was larger than anything Marcus had imagined. Scales the deep, weathered green of old copper, a single long scar tracing down one side of her jaw. She did not attack. She simply watched him with eyes that held far more patience than he had expected from something so large, waiting to see what a man foolish enough to climb alone to her doorstep intended to do. Marcus knelt on the cold stone and unfolded the blanket, laying it flat before her, the way a man might present something too important for words. He told her everything, plainly, the way he would have told it to anyone. About the 3 nights the smallest of her kin had crept into his bed for warmth, about the den and the scorch marks, and the choice he had made without ever quite deciding to make it. And then, because it seemed to matter, he told her about his grandfather, a story passed down through his family like an old, half-believed legend, about a dragon pulled burning and broken from a mountain fire decades before Marcus was born, wrapped in his very blanket, carried to safety by a young man who never spoke much of what he had seen that day. The guardian went very still. She lowered her great head slowly until it hovered just above the blanket and drew in a long breath, as though searching for something in the weave of the fabric itself. Whatever she found there, Marcus watched something shift behind those old, patient eyes, recognition settling over the way dawn settles slowly over a valley. He told her, last of all, about the men on the ridge trail, the map with his house circled twice, the nets and the hooks and the blades already fitted with scales that had once belonged to someone else's family. He told her they were coming within the night, and that he did not know if what waited for him at his cabin would be enough to stop it. The guardian rose then, unfolding to her full height for the first time, higher than the tallest pine on the ridge, wings spreading wide enough to blot out the pale morning sun. It was not aimed at him. Marcus understood that immediately, standing beneath that vast shadow without a single flicker of the fear he probably should have felt. She let out a sound unlike the roar the valley had heard weeks before, lower and somehow sharper, a call that rolled down the mountainside and did not stop at the tree line, and Marcus knew, standing there with his grandfather's empty blanket at his feet, that the mountain had just answered a call of its own. The men came just after moonset, when the dark was thickest and the cabin fires had long since burned to embers. Marcus heard them before he saw them, the soft crunch of boots trying too hard to be quiet, the faint metallic whisper of net weights shifting against each other in the dark. He had sent the villagers to the tree line an hour before, hidden and waiting, with instructions not to move until he gave the word. He stood alone at his cabin door instead, because he understood by now that whatever these men had come for, they would look for it there first. The 5 of them were pressed close behind him inside the cabin, and for the first time since he had carried them home wrapped in his coat, none of them were hiding. The dark one had planted itself directly in front of the hearth, small chest puffed out with a bravery that outmatched its size by a wide margin. The clumsy orange one had stopped stumbling entirely, standing steady and still in a way it had never quite managed before. Even the smallest one, the quiet one that had spent 2 weeks pressed against his boot, had crept forward to stand at the very edge of the doorway beside him, trembling but refusing to retreat. They were not running from what was coming. They were standing with him. The tall stranger reached the door first, motioning his 3 companions wide to circle the cabin from both sides. Marcus stepped out to meet him before he could reach for the latch, and for a long moment the 2 men simply stood facing each other in the dark, breath fogging between them. 5 of them, the tall man said quietly, almost pleasant about it, as though he were still discussing the price of iron. Worth more than you'll make in 10 years at that forge. Step aside, and no one has to get hurt tonight. Marcus did not step aside. He felt the green one press hard against his leg, and behind him, 5 small shapes that had gone from starving strangers to something closer to family in the space of a few short weeks. They're not for sale, he said, and they're not yours to take. The man's patience thinned considerably at that. He raised a hand, and the net came first, sailing out of the dark from somewhere to Marcus's left. He twisted away from it, felt the weighted edge catch his shoulder hard enough to spin him half around, and heard shouting break out on every side as the villagers came pouring out of the tree line with axes raised and torches lit. What followed was chaos, but not the kind of chaos Marcus had feared. The poachers, trained for stealth and quick theft, had not prepared for a full village standing between them and their prize. Old Tomas swung a torch that sent one man scrambling backward into fence. Another net went wide, tangling instead around a woodpile. Marcus caught the second thrown hook on the flat of a blade he had forged for exactly this kind of night, deflecting it hard enough to draw a shout of pain from a man who had thrown it. And then the sky itself seemed to open. The guardian came down out of the dark like the mountain, deciding, at last, to move, wings blotting out what stars had shone to the clouds, a wind rolling off her that knocked 2 of the poachers flat before she had even fully landed. She did not breathe fire on them. She did not need to. Her sheer size, the ancient fury in her eyes, the way the ground itself seemed to tremble under her weight, was more than enough to send even the tall man's careful patience shattering into pure animal fear. The four of them ran, not toward the cabin, not toward the map that had marked his home with red ink, but back down the mountain trail as fast as the dark and their own terror could carry them, leaving nets and hooks and blades scattered behind in the snow. In the middle of it, in the one heartbeat of danger that had come closest of all, a stray hook meant for the dark one had swung instead toward the smallest, the quiet one still trembling at the doorway. Marcus did not think. He simply moved, throwing himself between the blow and the small trembling shape that had spent 2 weeks falling asleep against his boot, taking the glancing edge of it hard across his own arm instead. The pain barely registered. What he felt instead, kneeling in the snow with the smallest dragon pressed hard and safe against his chest, was something he had not let himself feel in a very long time. Above them, the guardian settled slowly onto the ridge behind his cabin, wings folding, ancient eyes turning down at last, not with suspicion, but with something that looked, for the first time, very much like approval. The sun came up slow and gold over a mountain that had not seen a night like that in living memory, and Marcus sat on the frozen ground outside his cabin with his arm wrapped in torn cloth and 5 small dragons curled against him like they had never once considered being anywhere else. The villagers who had stood beside him in the dark did not simply drift back to their homes when it was over. They stayed through the morning, tending the scattered wreckage the poachers had left behind. And for the first time since word of the dragons had first spread through the valley, no one spoke of them with fear. Old Tomas, still a little pale from the night before, knelt slowly in the snow and let the orange one sniff cautiously at his outstretched hand. And when it did not bite, something in his face eased that had been tight for weeks. It was a guardian who came down from the ridge as the sun climbed higher, moving slower now, without the terrible urgency of the night before, until she stood over Marcus and the small pile of her grandchildren gathered around him. The villagers scattered back instinctively, but Marcus stayed exactly where he was, and after a moment, so did she. She lowered her great head until it was level with his, closer than she had ever allowed herself to come, and Marcus found himself looking directly into eyes that held far more than simple gratitude. There was recognition there, the same recognition he had seen on the ridge the day before, when she had breathed in the scent of his grandfather's blanket and gone still. She told him, in the only way a creature like her could tell a man anything, lowering one great wing until it curved gently around him and the 5 hatchlings both, drawing them all briefly into its shadow. It was not a threat. It was the closest thing to an embrace that something her size could offer, and Marcus understood it plainly enough. He had not simply stumbled into caring for 5 lost strangers. He had been found, the way his grandfather had once been found, by a bloodline that remembered kindness long after the humans who offered it passed on, and had waited generations to offer it back. The council came to him formally 3 days later, no longer speaking of danger to the livestock or fear of what might grow too large to control. They spoke instead of an alliance, the first the valley had ever made with anything beyond its own borders, and asked Marcus, who had spent 2 years living as quietly and invisibly as he could manage, to stand as the one who would speak for the mountain's newest neighbors. He said yes before they had finished asking. The 5 of them grew quickly after that, the way young things do once they finally have enough to eat and somewhere safe to grow. The dark one never did stop eating first. The orange one never did stop tripping over the same uneven floorboard, though it had long since stopped minding. The blue-gray one had, by early spring, taken to sitting close enough to let Marcus rest a hand along its back without flinching away, an inch of trust earned every day since the den in the woods. And the smallest one, the quiet one, had grown into the boldest of them all, as though some part of it remembered exactly who had stood between it and harm on the worst night of its short life, and had decided fear no longer had much of a place in it. Marcus's cabin, once the quietest place in the whole valley, was never quiet again. He built a second room onto it that spring, wide enough for 5 growing dragons to stretch out comfortably by the fire, though most nights, more often than not, at least one of them still found his way into the fold of his own blanket, exactly the way it always had. He thought sometimes, in the stillness just before sleep, of how close he had come to turning that first small warmth back out into the cold, simply because he had grown so used to being alone that he had forgotten what it felt like to be needed. He did not make that mistake twice. And on quiet evenings, with the fire low and 5 familiar shapes settled around him, he understood at last that he had not lost his family in that hard winter all those years ago. He had simply been waiting, without knowing it, for a new one to come find him. If this is the kind of story that stays with you, the kind you want to hear again on a quiet evening, stick around. There are more mountains, more valleys, and more unlikely families still waiting to be found, and the next one might be told tomorrow night